In this video, we're going to talk about how to use the concept of vapor pressure differential to understand condensation and to predict it when it happens inside your tent. We'll get to a more in-depth discussion of vapor pressure differential, but for now, just recognize that vapor pressure differential, which is the difference between the actual vapor pressure in your tent and the saturation vapor pressure, can be used to predict condensation inside your shelter. Now, two things happen every single night you camp. The first one is that the temperature drops. Here's a graph of actual measurements I took on a wilderness trip in July of 2022, where I'm measuring the inside and outside temperatures and relative humidities. I'm using a tarp tent dipole in this case. And you can see from the red line that as the evening proceeds, the temperature drops, and then as morning comes, the temperature rises. Likewise, the humidity inside that tent rises as well throughout the night. So let's take a closer look and see what's going on here. Consider what happens to relative humidity as the temperature drops. Put your focus on the blue line. So on the right-hand side of the graph, you have 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Consider this like the start of your afternoon right after you pitch your tent. And then maybe as you get ready to go to bed, the temperature has dropped to the 50s perhaps. And it continues to drop. And as that temperature drops, the relative humidity inside your tent is going to rise because of a temperature change. Colder air has a lower capacity to store water vapor than warmer air. So as the air cools, whether it's inside or outside your tent at night, relative humidity will increase. So the blue line shows the case where you have a relative starting humidity of about 15% at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the kind of environmental condition you might experience down in the desert, or perhaps midsummer in the Southern Rockies. The red line shows a starting humidity of about 25% at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is a very typical midsummer condition along the coastal ranges of Washington, Oregon, and California. The yellow line shows the case of air cooling when humidity is 50% at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is what you might find, for example, in the New England states during the summer. So you can see that the red and yellow lines both reach 100% humidity as the air cools. The red line reaches that 100% humidity level at a temperature in the low 30s, and the yellow line reaches it as it approaches about 50 degrees because it's holding more water. So it tends to reach 100% humidity at a warmer temperature than air that holds less water. And we all know what happens at 100% humidity. Air can no longer hold any more water vapor and it has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is usually a surface that's in contact with the air, like your tent fabric, and that's when we get condensation. But a second thing happens while you're in camp, and that is as you enter your tent, you respire and perspire and contribute to the moisture load. So now the air not only contains the ambient humidity, but you're contributing to a humidity increase as a result of your presence inside the tent. The humidity inside your tent can also increase if you are storing wet gear or if you're camping on wet ground. And for example, if that wet ground is underneath your vestibules, that moisture from the ground can enter your tent as humidity as well. This graph shows the results of a continuous environmental monitoring experiment that I did with the REI Flash Air 1 tent back in 2020. The blue line shows the relative humidity outside my tent, and the red line shows the relative humidity inside my tent. And you can see on the left-hand side of the graph that both of them are about the same until I enter the tent at around 10 o'clock that night. At that time, I'm starting respiration and perspiration. I've gotten into my sleeping bag, and now I'm contributing additional humidity in the tent, and you see that red inside humidity line increase significantly. The green double arrow shows the difference in relative humidity between inside and outside my tent. And throughout the night, obviously, you see a rise in relative humidity inside the tent. Now at about 4:30 a.m., I get up to go to the bathroom. And when I come back to bed, I find a lot of condensation in the tent. So I open the door and roll it back and bring in as much ventilation as possible. And now you can see the effects of that air exchange between the drier outside air and the wetter inside air. And you can see the line between the inside and outside relative humidity narrow. And then once the sun rises and hits the tent, you can actually see the inside humidity become lower than the outside humidity, which is a very unusual condition, and it only occurs when the temperature inside the tent rises dramatically above the outside temperature. Now, it's obvious that condensation occurs when the relative humidity reaches 100%. However, we often see condensation form at relative humidity levels that are well less than 100%. Let's explore why. Consider this well-known example where you have a hot summer day, you pour yourself a cold glass of ice water. Have you noticed that the outside surface of the glass immediately forms condensation? Let's break this example down a little bit. Let's say we're in a hot environment, temperature is 90 degrees Fahrenheit, relative humidity is fairly low at around 20%, and we pour ourselves a glass of ice water. That ice water is cold, it's going to cool down the glass, and the surface of that glass is going to be cold. For the environmental condition where we have a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity of 20%, we can calculate what's known as the dew point temperature using some mathematical gymnastics. That dew point temperature identifies the temperature at which a surface needs to be in order to form condensation on it. Now, you've already seen a hint of dew point temperature in a graph I showed a few slides ago, and it's the case where relative humidity increases to 100%. Water vapor has nowhere else to go, so it needs to condense on a surface. So for our Pacific Coast air, which has a relative humidity of 25% at 70 degrees, we have a dew point temperature somewhere in the 33 degree range. For our New England air, which has a relative humidity at about 50% at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, our dew point is somewhere on the order of 52 degrees or so. To ask the question whether or not condensation will form on the surface of our ice water glass, we need to know the surface temperature of that glass. If that surface temperature is less than the dew point temperature, condensation is going to form. For a typical glass of ice water, the surface temperature is going to be 40 degrees or less. That is less than the dew point temperature in this scenario, and we're going to have condensation on the surface of the glass. All right, now let's transfer this idea to the backcountry. What if our tent was the glass of ice water? Let's go back to our case study with the REI Flash Air 1 tent. The red line shows temperature, which is measured on the left-hand axis, and relative humidity, which is shown as the blue area and is measured on the right-hand axis. Two very interesting observations from this study. The first is that condensation formation is observed immediately upon entering the tent, even though relative humidity is less than 75%. The second is that relative humidity never exceeds 90%, yet the condensation is very high throughout the night. So from this data, we can actually calculate the dew point temperature and watch how that changes through the night. Maybe that'll give us some insight. The blue line shows dew point temperature. The red line shows the ambient temperature. So you can see that the dew point temperature remains below the ambient temperature throughout the night. That would suggest that this is not a condensation-prone environment. However, we do see a convergence between the ambient temperature and the dew point temperature, and that converges throughout the night until I get up and open the doors. And then we see a divergence of those two temperatures. So we are correlating some trends here. A convergence of dew point and ambient temperatures is increasing the condensation, and a divergence of the dew point and ambient temperatures is causing a drying condition. And I was able to observe that through the night. But we still have to wonder why, if the dew point temperature remains below the ambient temperature the entire night, why are we still getting condensation? And the answer to that is because the inside of a tent is not a homogeneous environment. These sensors are measuring one point in the tent. That point is averaged over a period of time, and there's lots of other stuff going on inside and outside the tent. We constantly have outside air coming into the tent, inside air leaving the tent, through tent vents and doors and underneath the walls and through the vestibules. There's wind that could impact airflow inside the tent. There's temperature gradients inside the tent because of how much heat loss is coming off your body. And those convective currents inside the tent can create heterogeneous environments that can change relative humidity or temperatures across various locations within the tent. And then finally, you have some impacts on the temperature of the surface of the fabrics used in the tent. And those temperatures can be impacted by things like radiation and the presence of wind. Now let's go back and talk about vapor pressure. Vapor pressure is the pressure exerted by water vapor molecules in the air. If you look at two scenarios, one where the temperature is 35 degrees and one where the temperature is 55 degrees, but you have a relative humidity of 65% in both scenarios, you can calculate the vapor pressure to be about 4.1 millibars in the left-hand scenario and 9.2 millibars in the right-hand scenario. So even though humidity is the same in both of these scenarios, the scenario where you have the warmer temperature results in a vapor pressure that's almost twice or more than twice the vapor pressure of the scenario where your temperature is only 35 degrees. But vapor pressure alone is not a predictor of condensation. Just because vapor pressure is lower in one scenario does not mean that you're more likely to get condensation in that scenario. We also have to look at saturation vapor pressure. This is the vapor pressure exerted by water in an environment where you have 100% humidity. And so let's look at the same two scenarios, but now with a relative humidity of 100%. The saturation vapor pressure at 55 degrees is much higher than the saturation vapor pressure at 35 degrees. But again, this property alone, saturation vapor pressure, is not a predictor of condensation. However, what if we looked at the vapor pressure differential, the difference between the saturated vapor pressure and the ambient vapor pressure? So here's the calculation shown for each scenario. On the left-hand side at 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 65%, we have a vapor pressure differential of 2.8 millibars. On the left-hand side, we have a condition with 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 65% humidity, and we can calculate the vapor pressure differential to be 2.8 millibars. On the right-hand side, we have an ambient temperature of 55 degrees, a relative humidity of 65%. We can calculate the vapor pressure differential to be about 5.6 millibars. If we correlate this to what we actually see in the field, the type of condition on the left will almost always produce condensation, and the type of condition on the right will almost never produce condensation, and it's directly related to the vapor pressure differential. If we plot both of these conditions on a graph with relative humidity on the x-axis and vapor pressure differential on the y-axis, we can see that for the 35-degree scenario, as we contribute more and more humidity into that air, up to about 60%, we can see that we've crossed below this condensation threshold, which occurs at about 3 millibars. But for the warmer air, 55 degrees, we can contribute as much as 80 or 85% humidity without promoting condensation in that air. After running literally hundreds of these kinds of environmental tests in all kinds of tents and all kinds of situations, this is my result of how to relate vapor pressure differential to condensation. And so if I can measure the vapor pressure differential inside my tent and come up with that number, I can accurately predict whether or not condensation is going to occur in the tent. Generally, the threshold for condensation lies at about 3 millibars. So if the vapor pressure differential is above 3 millibars, not likely to get any condensation, but if it's below 3 millibars, I am likely to experience condensation. This vapor pressure differential threshold has been corroborated in other fields as well. I put a reference down at the bottom so you can see how greenhouse scientists relate the performance of transpiration and condensation and evaporation in plants in a greenhouse to various levels of vapor pressure differentials. In short, vapor pressure differential is a more accurate predictor of condensation probability than relative humidity alone, because vapor pressure differential takes into account the effect of temperature on the water holding capacity of the air. So rather than giving a relative measure of the water content of the air, vapor pressure differential gives an absolute measure of how much more water the air can hold and how close it is to saturation. We spent a lot of time on the concept of vapor pressure differential and how it relates to condensation in our latest webinar, which is called Your Tent, Your Campsite, Your Comfort. And we use this concept to help you take control over whether or not you're going to have condensation in your shelter at your campsite. And we talk about tent design and the relationship between environmental conditions, campsite location, and what you do with your tent in order to minimize condensation. Check out that webinar, and we'll see you next time.